Arizona Territory, June 1882. The wedding dress was still white, but the woman inside it was coated in dust, her veil torn and dragging like a snake across the ground as she ran down the main street of Dead Creek. Josephine Pearlman's boots slapped hard against the packed earth, her bouquet long gone, her hands shaking. Folks watching from the saloon porch and general store steps didn't say a word at first, just stared. The silence cut deeper than any insult. Then the whispers came, and louder than whispers should be. She got left. Poor thing must have been at the altar. Too proud for any man anyhow. Josephine kept her head high, even while her heart thudded like a hammer in her chest. The man she was supposed to marry, Nathaniel Creed, had sent a wire from Prescott that morning. Changed plans. Do not wait. That was all. No explanation. No apology. Now she stood alone in the town she had only just moved to, dressed like a bride and abandoned like a stray dog. A horse stepped out of the alley near the blacksmith's, and on its saddle sat a tall man in a worn hat. He had dust on his coat and a rifle tied behind his saddle, but his eyes, clear and blue, followed her like he already knew her name. He did not laugh. He did not turn away. Josephine locked eyes with him for an instant, then kept walking, her spine straight, her stomach hollow. She passed the saloon, where a woman with rouge on her cheeks hissed, "Ought to have known better than to think she was good enough." It was not until Josephine reached the stables that her knees gave out. She sank onto a bench, the weight of shame and shock sinking down through her bones. She pressed her hands to her face and tried not to cry. "Ma'am," she looked up. The cowboy from the alley had tied off his horse and stepped near, hat in hand now. He had a kind face, lined by sun and time, maybe 30 or so, with calloused hands that gripped the brim of his hat like he was afraid to scare her. "Name's Elias Whitford," he said gently. "You all right?" She stared at him for a second. "Do I look all right?" He smiled, not mocking. "No, ma'am." "You look like hell, but you're still standin'. That counts for something?" "I was supposed to be married an hour ago. I figured." She stood up, brushing at the dress, though it was hopeless. "Do me a favor. If anyone asks," I kept walking. "All the way to Mexico. Not many brides make it to Mexico in a corset and lace." She almost laughed, but it came out as a sharp breath. "Then maybe I will fall over in the desert and the coyotes can have me." Elias looked at her for a long moment. "Or," he said, "you can come with me. I have a place outside town, not fancy, but it's quiet. You can rest, clean up. No one would bother you." She narrowed her eyes at him. "Why would you help me?" "Because I have 2 little girls, and if they ever found themselves in your shoes, I'd hope someone would show them some damn decency." Josephine blinked. "You have daughters?" "Charlotte is 6, Clara is 4. Their mother died 3 winters ago." The ache behind her ribs deepened. "I'm sorry." "So am I." She hesitated, then she nodded. "I will come, just for the day." Elias helped her mount his horse, her skirts bunched and tangled, but he was gentle, never looking where he should not. They rode out past the edge of Dead Creek, the town shrinking behind them, the whispers fading under the sound of hooves on hard, packed earth. His homestead was small, just a 2-room cabin with a corral and a shed, but it was clean. He dismounted first, offering his hand without saying anything. She took it. Inside, 2 little girls looked up from a pile of pine cones on the floor. Charlotte had tawny hair like her father, and Clara clutched a rag doll with wide eyes. "This is Miss Josephine," Elias said. "She's having a hard day, so we're going to be kind." Charlotte nodded solemnly. "You can have my blanket." Clara held out her doll. "You can hug her if you want." That was when Josephine's eyes filled. She crouched down, her skirts puddled around her, and whispered, "Thank you." Elias brought her water and a spare dress that had once belonged to his late wife. Josephine changed behind the curtain, swallowing the lump in her throat as she slipped out of the ruined white gown. When she came back, the girls were showing her how they made pinecone dolls. Later that evening, Elias lit a fire outside while Josephine sat on the porch. The girls were asleep inside, and the sky had turned to deep violet. "You do not owe me anything," Elias said as he passed her a tin cup. "I just figured. You needed a place to not be stared at." She looked at him. You are the first person today who looked at me without pity. I do not pity you, Josephine. Anyone who walks through town like that and does not break, that is not someone to pity. She watched him for a moment. You said your wife passed. I am sorry, that must have been. It was hell. Still is some days. His voice tightened. But the girls need me, so I try to be enough. You are. He looked at her then, really looked. You think so? I know so. They did not speak for a while. The fire crackled. A breeze stirred the cottonwood trees. When Josephine finally turned toward him, her voice was softer. I do not know what comes next. I do not have a plan. You do not need one tonight, she nodded slowly. I feel like I can breathe here. You can stay as long as you want. Josephine watched the flames. I might take you up on that. Elias tilted his head. Good. She smiled for the first time since the wire came. It was not wide, but it was real. Elias saw it and felt something shift in his chest, not pity, not charity, something steadier, warmer. And Josephine, though she would not say it yet, felt the same. By the third morning, Josephine was waking before the sun. The cabin still dim and hushed, but for the soft rustle of quilts and the occasional sigh from the girls. She moved quietly, slipping her arms into the calico dress Clara had called lucky-colored the day before. It had belonged to Elias's late wife, but Josephine didn't feel like an imposter in it anymore, only a guest with careful hands. She stepped outside barefoot, the porch boards cool beneath her soles. The desert was pale blue in the early light, the peaks in the distance painted soft with shade. Elias stood near the corral, tightening the cinch on a bay mare. He didn't look up until she reached the fence. I thought you were still sleepin', he said without surprise. I don't sleep late, he nodded. That's good. These days start early and they don't wait. Josephine leaned her arms on the top rail. Is she yours? She was my father's. Brought her down from Colorado before the war. She's old now but steady. What was he like? Elias didn't answer right away. He finished with the saddle, then stepped away from the horse and rested his hands on his hips. Hard man. Didn't believe in soft words or full plates, but honest. And he never raised a hand to my mother, which earned him more than most. Josephine let that settle. My father was a cantor, she said. In Boston, he had a voice that could hush a room. He wanted me to marry a banker. Elias gave her a sidelong glance. You don't strike me as a banker's wife. I didn't strike him as one either. The mare flicked her tail. A pair of quail darted past the fence, their heads bobbing like dancers in a hurry. Do you miss it? Elias asked. The city, sometimes. Books, music. The way people dressed like they had somewhere to be. She smiled faintly. But not the rest. People talk too much when they live too close together. You'll find they do that out here too, just with fewer teeth. She laughed quietly. Elias watched her, his face unreadable, but there was a lightness in his shoulders that hadn't been there when she first arrived. I was thinking, he said after a moment, if you're planning to stay a while, we could use another pair of hands with the garden. It's near gone to seed. I can do that. I'll pay you. No, he raised an eyebrow. I'm not here to be pitied or kept. Let me earn what I take. Elias nodded once. All right. That afternoon, Josephine dug her hands into soil that hadn't been turned in weeks, pulling weeds, patting down roots, marking rows with flat stones. Charlotte helped, placing each seed with careful precision, while Clara wandered between them with a tin cup full of water, pouring a trickle at every third plant. When the sun dropped behind the ridge and the sky burned orange, Elias called them in. Supper was cornbread, beans, and eggs from their own hens. They ate by lantern light, the girls chattering about a snake they'd seen in the shed rafters while Elias watched Josephine across the table like he was studying a map. Later, with the girls tucked in and the dishes cleared, Josephine stood near the hearth, combing her hair with her fingers. You know, Elias said from his chair, folks in town are still talkin'. I expect they are. They'll say worse if you keep stayin'. Josephine turned to face him. Let them, they don't get to decide what happens next. He looked down, thumb brushing the edge of his cup. I could tell them something different. She waited. I could say you're here because we're courting, Not out of charity, not because I found you lost. Just because I wanted you to be. Josephine crossed the room slowly. Her voice was low. And would that be a lie? Elias stood. They were close now, the fire between them throwing shadows across the floor. He didn't reach for her, but his voice was steady. I don't believe it would, she nodded once. Then say it. He held her gaze, and something unspoken passed between them, not a promise, not yet, but a beginning. Something true. The next Sunday, Josephine rode into town in a slate blue riding skirt, Charlotte perched behind her, Clara in front. Elias rode beside them, his hat tipped forward against the sun. They stopped at the mercantile, tied off the horses, and stepped into the heat and hush of 100 watching eyes. No one spoke. Not this time. Josephine carried herself not like a cast-off, but like a woman who had chosen her place. Elias didn't touch her, but he walked close, and Charlotte reached up to take Josephine's hand like it was the most natural thing in the world. Inside, Mrs. Tavers behind the counter blinked at them, then gave a tight nod. Good to see you out, Mr. Whitford. Elias nodded. Thank you. My wife needed flour. Josephine didn't flinch at the word. She only met the woman's gaze and held it. They left the store with a sack of flour, a spool of thread, and 2 peppermint sticks for the girls. As they mounted up again, someone muttered near the smithy, but Elias didn't turn. Josephine did. Her eyes met the man's, level and sharp, and he looked away first. They rode out side by side, the wind behind them, the desert wide and open ahead. The monsoon winds came late that year. By late July, the land around Elias's homestead had begun to crack along the surface, thin lines spidering through the clay like veins. The garden wilted under the weight of heat, but Josephine rose before dawn each day to shade the seedlings and pack damp cloth over the roots. She'd taken to wearing a wide-brimmed straw hat Elias found in the barn, its edge frayed and stiff, but it kept the sun off her neck. One morning, while she was tying string between 2 posts to train the beans, Elias leaned against the porch rail, a tin mug cooling in his hand. Reckon you've had that hat long enough to earn a better one, he said. Josephine tightened the string. If it's still standing after August, I'll consider it an heirloom. You're stubborn. You've only just noticed, he smiled, the kind that lived more in the eyes than the mouth. No. I noticed before you opened your mouth. She brushed her hands on her skirt and turned toward him. You could have said something then. I didn't want to get myself shot. I'm not the one with the rifle. He walked toward her, slow and easy, the way he always did when he wasn't sure whether to speak or stay quiet. When he reached the edge of the garden, he crouched beside the squash vines and traced a finger along one of the rough leaves. I sent off for a plow blade from Tucson, he said. Old ones about worn through, might come with the next freight wagon. Josephine raised an eyebrow. That's 2 weeks out, isn't it? Could be sooner. Elias, what are you trying not to say? He stood again. There's a man coming with it. His name's Arlen Bexley. He was my wife's brother. Josephine folded her arms. He's coming here, he wrote last month. Said he wanted to see the girls. It's been a long time. She nodded slowly, her face unreadable. And does he know I'm here? He does now. She waited. I wrote him back, told him you live here, that we're together. Josephine stepped back a little, not in fear but in thought. What does that mean, exactly together? It means you're a part of this place, of me. I didn't think it needed explaining. Her eyes searched his. You didn't ask. You didn't say no. She looked down at her hands, then back up. I didn't. Elias's jaw flexed once. He was never kind to her. My wife. He had opinions about who she should have married, about me. About the way I farmed, the way I spoke. He'll likely have opinions about you too. Let him try. He might stay a few days. I've stayed longer. He stepped closer. Are you afraid of him? I've lived through worse than a bitter man with a sharp tongue. He nodded once, as if that settled it. 2 mornings later, a wagon creaked up the dry trail, pulled by a tired gray mule. Arlen Bexley was younger than Elias, but carried himself with the same weariness like someone who'd seen too much and learned too little. He had a trimmed beard, pale eyes, and a voice that snapped like dry twigs when he greeted the girls. You've grown, he said to Charlotte. You look like your mother." Charlotte stared at him, then stepped behind Josephine's skirt. Clara didn't speak at all. Arlen's gaze shifted to Josephine. "So this is her." Josephine didn't flinch. "Josephine Whitford," his mouth twisted. "That what you're calling yourself now?" Elias stepped between them with a deliberate calm. "That's what she is. If you've got something to say it to me." "Funny," Arlen said. "Didn't figure you for marrying again. We didn't ask your opinion." Josephine touched Elias's arm. "Let him see what he came to see. Then he can go." Arlen stayed through the week. He slept in the shed, claimed he preferred the smell of hay to the sound of children. He asked no questions about the land, but plenty about Josephine, none of them to her face. She caught him watching her sometimes, not with curiosity, but with quiet calculation. Like he was trying to decide what part of her didn't belong. One evening, Elias found Josephine sitting on the back steps, her hands in her lap, her eyes fixed on the mesquite trees swaying in the wind. "He won't change," Elias said. "I don't need him to. I hate that he's here. You're not the only one." He sat beside her, knees brushing. They sat without speaking while a storm gathered far off, the sky bruising at the edges. Finally, Elias said, "When he leaves, I want to go into town." She turned her head. "Why?" "I want to speak to the preacher." Josephine blinked. "Elias, I want to say it right, with the girls there, with you standing beside me without shame. I want the records to show what we already know." She didn't answer, not right away, but her fingers found his and she held tight. "You're sure?" "I was sure the first time you took your boots off to kneel in my garden." Josephine's laugh caught in her throat. "That's a poor reason to marry. It's not the only one." The storm never broke that night, only hovered at the horizon. But the next morning the air was cool and clear, and Arlen Bexley left without saying goodbye. Elias watched him go, then turned to Josephine and said, "We ride for town at first light." She didn't nod. She only reached for his hand, and that was answer enough. They left before the sun crested the eastern hills, the sky pearl-colored and still. Charlotte rode on Elias's saddle, Clara on Josephine's lap, her fingers wound tight in the front of Josephine's bodice. The trail into town was quiet, the dust rising in low swirls behind them, and the silence held a kind of reverence, like the land itself knew what the day would bring. Josephine had braided her hair into a single rope and pinned it under a linen bonnet. Her dress was slate green, plain but neat, with a row of bone buttons down the front. Elias wore his Sunday shirt, the one with the collar that never quite lay flat, and his boots had been scrubbed clean with lye and sand. He didn't talk much on the ride, and she didn't ask him to. They tied off the horses behind the meeting hall. The preacher, a soft-voiced man with a crooked gait, stood waiting under the shade of the cottonwood tree beside the door, his Bible tucked beneath one arm. He'd been told they wanted no gathering, no sermon, just the words spoken plain and clean, with the girls beside them and no one else in attendance. Inside, the air was warm and still, the wooden benches empty but for the line of light cast across the floor from the high windows. "You ready?" Elias asked, standing straight, his hand resting lightly at Josephine's back. "Yes." The preacher opened the book and began, his words low and steady. Not once did Josephine's gaze leave Elias's. When asked if she would take him, she answered without hesitation. "I will." Elias nodded once before he spoke his part, his voice rooted deep in his chest. "I will." Charlotte blinked up at them from her seat, her legs swinging just above the floor. Clara had fallen asleep against Josephine's side, her cheek pressed to the folds of her skirt. When it was done, the preacher closed the book and extended his hand. Elias shook it. Josephine did too. There was no applause, no cheering. Just a silence that felt like something had settled into place. On the way out, Elias paused under the cottonwood and looked over at her. "You all right?" "Yes." "You sure?" She nodded. "I've never been more certain of anything." They walked to the mercantile next, their steps quiet along the boardwalk. Inside, Josephine bought fabric for new curtains and a skein of red thread. Elias picked up a sack of oats and a tin of oil for the lantern. The shopkeeper, A man with a narrow face and a habit of rubbing his chin when nervous watched them closely but said nothing. When Elias placed the coins on the counter, the man cleared his throat. "Congratulations," he said, not meeting Josephine's eyes. She took the fabric gently from the counter and didn't reply. Outside, a woman crossed the street behind her wagon, a child on her hip. She paused just long enough to glance their way, then looked again. This time she nodded, brief but deliberate. Josephine drew a breath through her nose. "Did you see that?" Elias adjusted the oats on his shoulder. "I did." She didn't sneer. Not even a little. They walked back to the horses, the girls trailing behind them, Clara now awake and chewing a piece of the peppermint Josephine had taken from her coat pocket. On the trail home, Josephine rode close beside Elias. The girls chatted about the spotted calf they'd seen in the neighbor's pasture, but Josephine stayed quiet. Elias glanced over. "What's in your head?" "I was just thinking. I never imagined this would be my life. Good or bad, neither, just unexpected." "But it fits." "I know what you mean," he said. "I used to think I'd never feel settled again, not after losing her. Then you showed up in that dress and the road turned." She watched the horizon. "I don't mind the dust anymore." "No, it smells like something honest." He reached across the space between their horses and took her hand. The reins rested loose in her other palm. When they reached the homestead, the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows across the porch. The hens clucked near the coop, and a breeze stirred the weathered sheet Elias had nailed across the garden frame for shade. Josephine dismounted and handed Clara down into Elias's arms. Charlotte ran ahead to check the water trough. Josephine lingered beside the porch steps. "I'll finish the curtains tomorrow," she said. "No rush. I want them done before supper. I want this place to look like us." Elias smiled, slow and sure. "It already does." She reached up and touched the edge of his collar, smoothing it. "Then it's home." He didn't reply, just leaned forward and kissed her. Not fast, not hungry, just a quiet press of mouth to mouth, like sealing a letter written long ago. The wind lifted through the cottonwoods, and the last of the sunlight spilled over the hill behind them. Josephine stepped through the door first, and Elias followed, the girls already laughing near the stove. Nothing loud, nothing grand. Just a house with its light lit and the promise of supper. The summer waned without thunder. The garden, stubborn and sun-creased, gave up small tomatoes and thick-skinned squash. Josephine kept a linen ledger beneath the kitchen shelf, where she marked each harvest with tidy lines and plain ink. Clara had begun learning her letters from that same book, tracing her finger along the slant of her mother's handwriting while Josephine stirred supper. One evening, Elias came in later than usual, his boots tracked with clay, a coil of wire slung over his shoulder. He set it down beside the door and eased onto the bench by the hearth, unbuttoning his cuffs with a weariness that settled in his shoulders. "Found the fence down near the arroyo," he said. "Could have been a deer, but I saw prints too. Narrow. Not fresh." Josephine looked up from where she was sewing a patch onto Charlotte's dress. "You think someone came through, could have just been passing, but I'm going to ride out past the ridge tomorrow. Make sure nothing's missing. Take the rifle." "I will." She folded the dress cloth over her knees. "I'll stay up till you're back." He reached out, his hand brushing hers. "You always do." The next morning, Elias was gone before first light. Charlotte helped with the washing, her elbows soaked and her braids half undone by mid-morning. Around noon, Josephine noticed the hens hadn't been fed. She wiped her hands on her apron and stepped outside, the sun pressing down through a pale sky. At the coop, she found the gate open and a feathered trail leading toward the brush. One of the hens was missing. A fox, maybe. She followed the path a little ways, stopping where it disappeared into the scrub. As she turned back, she spotted something half buried beneath a patch of mesquite, a scrap of blue cloth caught on a branch. She knelt, tugged it free. It was part of a man's shirt too fine to belong to Elias, with a silver button still clinging at the collar. She folded it into her pocket and said nothing when she returned to the house. Elias came back just before dusk, his jaw set tight. He washed up at the pump and came inside with the same stillness he wore when something sat wrong in his chest. "I found tracks again," he said. "Same ones." Headed along the southern edge, not toward the town, Josephine opened her palm and showed him the cloth. "Found this at the coop." He turned it over, frowning. "Not from anyone local, could be a traveler. Could be someone looking for a place to sleep without asking. We have 2 little girls in this house." "I know." He didn't ride out again that week, but he walked the edge of the property every evening, rifle slung across his back. Josephine never asked for updates. She only made sure supper was hot when he returned. By August's end, the prince stopped showing. No more missing hens. Nothing broken or taken. Still, Elias kept the rifle closer. Josephine tucked the cloth scrap into a drawer and never mentioned it again. That same week, a letter arrived from Elias's sister in Colorado, a woman Josephine had never met. It came folded in a fine hand, pressed with lavender. Elias read it slowly at the table, his thumb tracing the edge of the paper. "She heard about us from someone who passed through," he said. "She wants to come for Christmas. Bring her son, says she wants to meet the woman who filled the house again." Josephine didn't answer for a moment. Then, "Do you want her here?" "I want her to see what's real. She was kind when Clara was born, sent a quilt." "I think she's trying," Josephine nodded. "Then we'll make space." The weeks passed into cooler air. The garden yellowed and gave way to seed. The girls collected fallen pecans in the dry creek bed, storing them in sacks beneath the porch. Josephine began sewing heavier dresses, piecing together scraps from the bottom drawer, humming songs from her childhood under her breath. One afternoon, as Elias leaned against the porch post, watching the girls race across the yard, he said, "I've been thinking about the barn." Josephine looked up from her mending. "What about it?" "I want to build a second room off the side. Make it a place for you to work when the girls are at their lessons. You could have a window that looks out toward the cottonwoods." She set the cloth in her lap. "You do that for me?" "I'd do anything that made you stay longer. I'm not going anywhere." Elias stepped toward her, crouched down, and took her hand. "You've taken root here." She pressed her forehead to his. "So have you." They married again that fall, just the 4 of them, down by the dry creek bed beneath the cottonwoods. Charlotte carried a string of dried flowers around her neck. Clara sang nonsense while Josephine and Elias exchanged rings they'd carved from walnut wood. There was no preacher this time, just their own voices, quiet and sure. That winter, Elias's sister arrived with her boy, a solemn child with wide eyes. She brought stories, preserves, and a new quilt for the girls. She sat beside Josephine by the fire and asked about the garden, about the land, about how she kept the shelves so well stocked. "I didn't expect to like you," she said one night, a cup of tea cooling in her hands. "But you fit." Josephine smiled. "I do." By spring, the barn wall had been framed and covered. The new room had a window that opened out to the cottonwoods and a chair carved by Elias's hand. Josephine kept her ledger there, her scraps of cloth, and a small oil lamp that flickered against the glass each evening. The prince never returned. The hens grew fat again. Clara learned to read. Charlotte began asking where babies came from, and Josephine answered her with honesty and care. Elias's hands grew more weathered, but his eyes stayed kind. Some nights they sat on the back steps, her head on his shoulder, the girls asleep just beyond the door. Once, near midsummer, he said, "I used to think peace was something that passed through like weather. And now, I think it's something you build with your hands. And with someone who doesn't leave." She kissed his temple, her voice warm against his skin. "Then we've built it." And they had, the land gave as much as it could. The girls grew taller. The house held their laughter, their sorrows, their quiet mornings. And through all of it, Josephine and Elias remained rooted, steady and wholly in love.